Hi everybody, welcome to Land and Sea. Thanks for joining us. I'm Pauline Thornhill. Well, she was born in Labrador in the early 1800s, Aunt Lydia Campbell. Aunt Lydia wrote about life in Labrador, and her stories had been passed down through the generations. In this show, filmed almost 30 years ago, Dave Quinton tells Aunt Lydia's story through two of her descendants.
Labrador, a land of wild, savage splendor. An awesome, magnificent place on the edge of the Western world. For a long while, the white man shunned this place they call Labrador. It was not easy to live here. Only those especially adapted to life in the north could survive in this environment. Only those tuned to the ways of the caribou and the seal. And so, while gentler lands to the south were settled and developed, most of Labrador remained untamed, untouched, a cold northern wilderness, timeless, unchanging. Till sometime near the end of the 18th century, when a few bold souls made their homes on the coast and lived as fishermen and hunters. They adopted native customs, they married native girls, and from one such union, somewhere here, on the shores of Eskimo Bay, a girl was born. Her name was Lydia. Lydia Campbell, a sensitive girl. From her Inuit mother, she learned the ways of the land and the sea. From her English father, she learned to read and to write, and the customs of a strange and different land across the ocean, a land she would never see. She lived the life of a trapper's wife. She worked hard and raised two families, and she observed closely the world about her. She never left the shores of Eskimo Bay. This was her home. This was her life. This was her world. And a rich world it was to Lydia. She wrote of the animals and birds about her. She wrote of the trees and the berries and the salmon and trout. And of her mother's people, the Inuit, skimming across the bay in the summertime in their kayaks. And so, somewhere here, in a lonely cabin, a long time ago, a woman of Labrador, at the request of a visiting missionary, copied down in a scribbler her story of Labrador. Aunt Lydia Campbell. She lived here in Labrador a long time ago. Unheralded in her time, her grave is unmarked. But her legacy lingers on in the lives of her many descendants, many of whom continue to live on the shores of Eskimo Bay, or Lake Melville as it's called today. One of them is Jean Crane of Happy Valley. Jean is an artist. Like her great-great-grandmother Lydia, she draws her inspiration from the country about her. The same lakes and hills and mountains that Aunt Lydia knew and loved. And often, Jean feels the urge to go back, to visit the places that Aunt Lydia lived in. It's a kind of spiritual renewal to put on the snowshoes and go back to Lydia's country. While Jean has grown accustomed to the modern comforts of city life, she hasn't forgotten her roots. She well remembers her childhood days when the family fished and trapped for a living here on the shores of Lake Melville. The time not so long ago when life wasn't all that different from the days of Aunt Lydia. Mulligan was one of the places where Aunt Lydia lived and wrote her stories.
Well, Mulligan is a link day with the past in that Mulligan has never been a defunct community. People have always lived here. Very few, but people have. And people who used to live here have now re-established their little bits of land and built cabins and retained much of the flavor of the past in how they live.
Lydia was the first native-born Labradorian to write about her country, and she does so with grace and wit and wisdom. She gives a touching insight into pioneer life, of the days when the white man first came. In her life and in her writings, we see a fascinating fusion of European and native cultures.
She was the daughter of Ambrose Brooks, an Englishman, who married an Eskimo girl. And Lydia was one of their children who was married twice. And she wrote about her life. So we have knowledge of what she thought of her life. And we believe she had a great philosophy on life and that she was a very fine person. We're quite proud of Lydia. She means to me a person who, way back then, observed the beauty of Labrador, who realized that she was living a good life and that you can live fishing and hunting and close to nature. And I'm that sort of a person. When I come back to Mulligan, where she had her families, I can get lost in those times and I can be Lydia when I'm here. Mulligan River, 1894. As I am writing these few lines before daylight, my use in the morning is rising to make a fire, say my prayers, wash lamps, get on the breakfast, sweep the house. So after breakfast, I, old Lydia Campbell, 75 years old, I puts on my outdoor clothes, takes my game bag and axe and matches in case it is needed, and off I goes over across the bay, over ice and snow for about 2 miles and more. Gets 3 rabbits, some days out of 20 or more snares. Some winters we have the luck to get a deer or two. Sometimes formerly we have had as many as 10 or more in one winter. I myself have been deer hunting and shot 2, but my sister Hannah Michelin have killed 3 in one spring. That was while I was still afraid to shoot.
And so Aunt Lydia continued to provide for her children and her children's children well into her old age. Shooting partridge, snaring rabbits, catching trout and salmon, gathering wild berries, and tending her garden. But always finding time to read her Bible and to write her observations of Labrador life.
Mulligan River, January 1894. My dear friend, you want to know more things about the country ways and fashions. It has been my home ever since I was born, and I have seen many ups and downs. When I first remember to see things and to understand, I thought there was no place as good as this in the world, and that my father and mother and my 2 sisters were the best in the world. But our good father used to take me on his knee and tell me his home was a better country. Only it was hard to live there, for the wars was raging between England and France, and all over the world, and the press gangs were pressing young men. So he and a lot more English people came up the shore for woodcutters, seal fishing and cod fishery, which was the highest in these days. Then, of course, they had to take wives of the natives of this country. There were very few white men here, much less women. We lived up in the river head of a long bay, and no one nearer to us than 70 miles. Our dear father had no school book to teach us in nothing but a family Bible. About this time, people began to settle, one after another, mostly French people, few English, for everything was plentiful at that time. People could stand on the rocks and hook fish ashore on the beach and spear the salmon that was swimming along the shore. The white whales was in the bay then, so was the walrus and the white bears. I have seen but one of each kind since I remember. My dear friends, my time is too short to write much longer. We are now going to get our winter fish while we can. Or we never stops work unless we are eating or sleeping in the night, or singing or reading prayers. On Sunday, we have the spell on that happy day.